Hi, everybody. Um, you are probably very excited to have our evening classes canceled. Actually, it's about 4:18 right now when I'm recording this. Welcome to my house and to my kitchen and my kitchen table. You're probably excited, and as you are probably not surprised, I was frustrated that we have our classes canceled again this evening because I'm looking out my window right now to just some rain, and it is 36 degrees outside here in Wilmington, Delaware. So I hope that wherever you are, you're warm, and I hope you're safe. I don't know what other areas are like, but I'm looking at a clean interstate and clean neighborhood roads here. Anyway, this evening we were going to be number one as our check-in, everyone was going to go around and share what they were going to be doing for their identity plan. I know we did it last week, but this week I was going to say go around real quick and do the final draft of what you're going to be doing. If you haven't done that yet, please go into your Google Docs and update your plan so that I can have a look before next week to sign off on them. And then the next phase we were going to do is process the NMC Horizon report from 2 years ago. And I was going to do a bit of a walkthrough, bit of a lecture, and then open us up for some conversation, maybe watch some videos, etc. Since we're not together, I have converted my notes. You'll see on here, you can, if you still want to have access to those to the Google Doc, I would have printed them out for you and given you a hard copy, and then walk you through this. I have converted these notes into some slides, and I'm sitting here now at the kitchen table recording this for you. I'm just going to ask that you have a watch of this recording of me walking you through some of the highlights of the report. And when we're together next Tuesday, God willing, you better be practicing your non-anti-snow dances, because literally no more time for this nonsense. When we're together next week, part of what we'll do with our check-in then is focus on this, because we've just got too much other stuff to do and talk about. So, and I'll close this out with some reminders for next week. Hopefully this will be about 20-25 minutes, depending on how long I go. I do have my water bottle, so if I get a little dry, I can keep going. So this is my overview of the NMC Horizon 2017 Higher Education Report that you were to read, to skim this week to prepare for class this evening. Let's get started. So at first, just some general overview, some general notes to give you additional context. This is published by the quote-unquote NMC, which is the New Media Consortium. We'll talk about that in just a second. And I've put EDUCAUSE up here because if you're aware of EDUCAUSE, if you go Google EDUCAUSE, you'll find it. I think they're funded by they're funded by a bunch of billionaires, a bunch of bigwigs, the EDUCAUSE is. The reason why I've put this on here is because technically the NMC, the New Media Consortium, has been purchased by EDUCAUSE, so they don't exist anymore, but they kind of still exist. We weren't really sure when I went to Google to prep for our class this evening. I went and double-checked. EDUCAUSE has now revamped that webpage and still has all of the NMC reports up there, so you can go. It's still there if you Google the NMC. So what is the New Media Consortium, even though they've now been bought by EDUCAUSE and we're not really sure? So what they were. Also, Cone of Silence, when I share you this link to this conversation, it will be a hidden URL for YouTube, so let's just keep that on the DL, right? Because I'm going to say things here that may be a bit critical, especially considering our work, so let's just be mindful of that. So the New Media Consortium is a bunch of, as far as I can tell, you can go look at the authors and the people who contributed. There are some professors, there are some people in academia that contribute to these reports, to the New Media Consortium reports. But they are largely written by people outside of academics, outside of schools. That there are some people who put their name on these reports so that it lends credibility for the report and it gives them some academic credibility. But generally large, and as you see, this is business focused, this is industry focused. These are people who own companies people who are trying to sell software, people who are trying to sell devices. It may not be immediately obvious what they're up to selling-wise, but you'll see throughout my notes there are some parts where it's like, okay, this is kind of obvious. They do, or they used to do, the NMC used to publish reports for K-12, for higher ed, for, they may even do like for admin, for administration. They used to do like a good number, like 5 or 6 reports. Again, if you go Google, you'll see the different reports that they've done. The one that we have focused on is the one for higher ed. But the question you'll see in bullets 2 and 3 is, how do we read this document, and then what do we do with this information? I think it's important for you to know, A, that it comes out of a group that is business focused, industry focused, just FYI. That it's relevant that they have just been bought up by EDUCAUSE. EDUCAUSE seems to be buying up a lot of these sort of independent organizations or independent entities. I think it's interesting to the extent that it gives us some conversation points. The reason why they write these reports, and the one we're looking at again is focused on higher ed, the reason why they write these reports is to kind of throw out a gauntlet of sorts. They throw some ideas at the wall to see what will stick. But it's always an interesting game because they are simultaneously trying to predict the future, which they can't do, and then also kind of weave in their own industry narrative. Oh, adaptive learning is where we're going, or oh, machine learning is where we're going, when they just so happen to work for companies that support and advocate for machine learning. So, you'll find on pages 4 to 5 interesting charts re-timing, looking at some historical perspectives of what the past NMC reports have shown. It may be interesting for you to see, for you to check out. The other thing that's interesting is when I first had this conversation, the notes that I'm going to walk you through was in 2017. And that happened to be the first time I taught this class. So this document was like fresh off the presses. It was only a couple of months old. What'll be interesting for us now is to see if some of their predictions came true or not. I think it would be interesting for you in particular in y'all's different areas of your work to see how some of these themes show up in your work or don't. Or maybe they do show up and they're just using a different kind of language, maybe. So I think this is more interesting for us to get kind of like a bigger picture, like a bird's eye view, which is what we're going to talk about in a second, of what's going on in the larger narrative. And you kind of see, like from last week where we talked about theory and history and philosophy, to this week we've gotten, whoa, zoom out, looking at a big picture with kind of an industry perspective. And then you'll see next week we're going to go zoom in really, really specific and look at student development and student identity. This first couple of weeks are focused on like getting a really big lay of the land, because then we're going to start deep diving into some other issues like the hermeneutics and policy and whatnot. So, enough of the general notes. Oh, well, I guess I've already kind of hinted at these, but some specific general points to consider. Look at the overall tone. What sort of stance perspective are these authors coming at? In particular, it is focused on work, economics, and jobs, getting people into jobs, like the purpose of higher education or university. You may have different philosophical positions on what the purpose of higher education is. I know I do. The different ones that differ from the authors and the ideas that we're about to talk about or that you skimmed. I apologize if you hear my washer going in the background. One wonderful thing about this now second snow day is I can catch up on household things. I've literally washed everything in my house that will fit into the washer, but we have one of those supposedly high efficiency German washers that just seems to make lots of noise. I don't really know why it's high efficiency or whatever, but you're going to hear it spinning like a ride at Disney World coming out here in a second. I think my microphone will pick it up. Anyway, general points to consider. I also have to poke some fun before we get too deep. You can kind of tell that these reports weren't written by academics, or they weren't written by folks serious into scholarship. I've given a quote here to give just one example of some of the logical obviousness of some of the supposed earth-shattering results that they share to support their claims. So in particular on page 13, when they're talking about problem solving and problem-based learning, they ask the question, does problem-based learning improve problem-solving skills. Let's not even bother to pick apart the question, because the question itself contains the answer, if you think about it for a second. Let's look at what they say. Quote, a study reveals that when students in an experimental group were given 4 problems to solve, they significantly improved their problem-solving abilities. Folks, this is not groundbreaking research. This is basically like saying, news flash, child who practiced piano got better at playing piano. Right? This is not earth-shattering, and it only takes a little bit of critical thought to scratch on the surface of this report to kind of pick some holes in it. However, and again, this is the part where we don't share, if you can imagine for higher ed, imagine your boss's boss's boss reading a report like this, and then it will kind of make sense. And you wonder, like, where do all these buzzwords come from that my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss keep talking about? It's like this is great stuff for CIOs, for chief information officers, or for VP techs in universities or colleges. Because they'll come to you and say, we need to do problem-based learning. And you're like, okay, well, all right. And again, the other thing, and this is a bit particular for me, specifically, because you can see what I think it's lacking. Hold on. Is that they have a particularly reductive version or understanding of learning. This you'll no doubt recognize from my critique of machine learning and from the Peace of Mind that you read. You can start to see the germs of those ideas now, hopefully, in this. I think they have an impoverished or reductive understanding of learning. If you are really interested in what this means and what I mean by that, I'd recommend you look at, for example, the phenomenological perspective. These ideas are not new. They are actually quite old. Herbert Dreyfus, who died just a couple of years ago, first wrote these writings. This was when he was young, but he wrote those when he was at MIT, doing some fairly basic critiques of the claims that these folks make about learning and machine learning and whatnot that have yet to be surpassed. So it's just interesting. You won't see Dreyfus referenced in this report. Again, it just shows how their goal is over here, and it's not really to provide a holistic account of where things are at and where things are going. So, with this named, let's do a bird's eye view of the report. So it's organized into big themes. Here are the 3 big themes: 1, key trends; 2, challenges; 3, important developments. And then they're organized, at least the key trends and the important developments are organized with timelines. So the key trends are short-term, mid-term, and long-term, and they define that. Long-term is anything beyond 5 years, obviously. And important developments, they also organize by time: a year or less, 2 to 3 years, 4 to 5 years. I point these out because technically, based on when this report was written, we should be in the almost midterm range for the key trends, and important developments, we should be right at the 2 to 3 year mark. So when we get to those slides, I'll make a point to say, I wonder if we look around right now, is this kind of where we're heading? And then the other section, the other chunk, the second one that I skipped over is challenges. Some people enjoy that they name the different kinds of challenges we're going to face as solvable, difficult, or wicked. Also, they did not invent that idea. It is pretty well documented. A quote-unquote wicked problem is a well-documented phenomenon in qualitative research and also in science and technology studies. Kind of like the black box we talked about from last week or 2 weeks ago. Wicked problems are just ones that are incredibly difficult to solve, maybe even impossible to solve. I would argue that we maybe shouldn't look at technology to solve those problems, and maybe that's why they seem so wicked, but what do I know? I just teach this stuff. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through each of these features of the report, and I'm going to focus in and walk you through what they mention. This is why when I told you, don't be scared of a 60-page report, because I'm going to walk you through the highlights. So some of this you will go, oh, okay, well, I read that section, so I don't really have to listen to them that much. Other parts where you didn't maybe look at, tune in and have a listen to what I'm saying. So key trends, adoption. So things that are going to be adopted in a certain time frame. So they said that two things we're going to come up in the short term. The first is blended learning, and the second is collaborative/cooperative learning. First thing to say is, as a philosopher of education, those are not new ideas. They are quite old ideas. We may have a transformed understanding of what blended learning is. For example, the flipped classroom. I'll explain that in a second. And then a transformed idea of what's possible with collaborative learning. But as basic ideas and philosophy of education, it's not that different. There's an argument to be made that even though we all hate it, and current research says it doesn't really work, that homework is a version of blended learning. You do some here, you do some there. But currently how they understand it is that you use technologies to do what they're really good at, which is, record lectures and have people watch like this. And then when you're together face to face, you do other things that make more sense to do, like have discussions and whatnot, because we all hate discussion boards in online learning, me included. And I'm as a teacher, I hate reading them. Sometimes you just got to bite the bullet. And then they give an example of a flipped classroom. This is more popular, started in K-12, but is also it's been seen as a cost-saving measure in higher ed. The flipped classroom, literally what I just described. So instead of having a 500-person lecture class come and to lecture 3 times a week, a professor can record lectures, have people have a 500-person class, watch outside of class, answer some questions, come into class time, and instead of being lectured at, they do practice problems, they do homework, they do whatnot. So literally it's the idea of the flipping of the classroom. So homework is in class, and what you do in class happens at home or outside the class. The other one is collaborative or cooperative learning. What's interesting, and I put this as the first bullet, another point that they have not acknowledged is that those two terms, which they use glibly or glibly interchangeably, those are actually two very different positions within educational theory and with educational practitioners. So collaborative learning means something different than cooperative learning. They just put them and equalize them as out together, but you should know that they are not the same. Some critiques is collaboration, all it's cracked up to be. Says collaboration is an important undercurrent from many of the other topics in this report, and they mention specific software like WeChat or Slack. Literally everyone I know that is involved in a business or works in a team is using Slack. If you don't know it, go Google it. It's just a piece of software. It's kind of like AIM, Instant Messenger, and Dropbox, and Twitter all smashed together into like a little workspace online. It's been fairly popular. The catching and advising mistakes at Georgia State. We talked about this the first week, I think. So I'm not going to expand on that. Then looking at open badge as an alternative to assessments. So instead of awarding grades for particular activities like collaborative learning, you would award a badge, like almost like Boy Scout or Girl Scout. Although I think now they they didn't merge, but Boy Scouts now will accept girls. I'm not sure, but that's the whole idea of open badges. That's 1 to 2 years. Don't know how well that held up in time, but maybe Westchester's weird. Looking at the midterm, which would be 3 to 5 years, I would agree on the second one. The first is measuring learning, and the second is redesigning physical learning spaces. I will agree with the second bullet. And actually, let's start there. They mentioned that in the 3 to 5 year term, there will be a redesigning of physical learning spaces. You only have to look so far as look at how they redid Anderson Hall. If you haven't, I know on the second floor where we meet, it doesn't look that different. Go to the third floor and go look at the classrooms. They're all very different. They have TVs in the walls. The chairs all move. It looks a lot like, or the business building, if you've had class in the business building, of course, because they're the business folks. They got all the money and all the nice classrooms. And then recitation, we have one room, 311, I think it is, that is one of these new transformed learning spaces that are supposed to be like really supportive of collaboration. And then recitation 306 will eventually, it used to be a computer lab. We're not sure what it's going to be, but we're hoping it's going to be one of these. We have a makerspace, at least one in the library. I think we have another one. Right now, Recitation 311 holds 1, 2, 3 of our 3D printers. A lot of the makerspaces. Again, these ideas have come from K-12, and they're now coming up into us, into higher ed. The Solstice, that's you noticed if you guys have been here one term. So about a year and a half ago, we all went home from summer, and then when we came back after summer break, every classroom had one of those giant televisions in it with the Solstice, with the Ramcast, maybe is what you may know it as, Ramcast. It was, I think, the reason why they did it that way is they got a cheaper deal if they did them all. But literally, it went like overnight. We moved away from projectors and smartboards to the Ramcast. That one I'll agree with. Measuring learning, the other midterm key trend, focuses on learning analytics. I think is interesting, and it's an interesting idea. And you'll notice my critique you remember my critique. I think it misunderstands what learning is. I think it also misunderstands that you can measure learning. And I also think it misunderstands what computers are actually capable of doing. And I think I mentioned this last week or the week before, that this is not necessarily an attack on learning analytics or measuring learning or AI. It's just it's a misrepresentation of the field. I've given you 2 quotes here relevant to that. I'm not going to read them to you. You may read them to yourself. Looking at the long term, which is more pie in the sky as far as these ideas, but cultures of innovation and then deeper learning. I love the quote from page 10 that higher education has evolved into hotbeds of entrepreneurship and discovery. Whoa. That's one of those, they put that in there to make the VP of tech in higher ed. They made them happy. An interesting idea of accepting failure. And then deeper learning, PBL times 2, project and problem-based learning. Again, they are 2 different ideas in educational thinking and educational theory, but they just collapse them and put them together. Quote, a goal of higher education is to equip students with the skills they need to be successful in the workplace. Some people would agree to that, and some people would not. I would be one that would challenge that. I think that may be one of the goals, and maybe not even the most important one. What's interesting is that they call this a long-term goal when, again, if you knew anything of the history of education, you would know, or history of universities or higher education, you would know that this has been an ongoing conversation, what the purpose of higher education is and the relevancy for work and for business and industry. Let's move on to the second. There are 3. I'm going to do a quick click through so you see where we're going. Remember that in the second, we're talking about challenges that are solvable, that are difficult, and that are wicked. So we're just going to quickly do our overview of those. So they see solvable problems as number 1, improving digital literacy, and number 2, overcoming the formal informal learning. I think they are correct on the first and dead wrong on the second. They are misunderstanding what learning is, and they are misunderstanding the university culture and climate for what the difference between formal and informal learning. I'll explain myself in a moment. Improving digital literacy, preparing students for the future is the core mission of higher education. Okay, sure. That sounds like, again, it sounds like a really great platitude, but duh. Of course it is. Looking at mindful media consumption, sure. So should we improve people's digital literacy? Of course. The relative importance compared to the rhetoric, I'm not so sure about. But as a general idea, yeah, it's probably a good idea to do that. Now, the difference between formal and informal learning, I think they're a bit missed on. So what they mean is they're casting higher education as formal learning, like courses and credits, and you get grades and you get certifications, relative to informal learning. That how do you account for lived experience, life experience? So maybe I work for a sales team. Maybe I went to high school and I never went to college, but I've been working on a sales team since I was 19, so I have about 10, 15 years of experience. Can I get course credit for that? Can I get college credit for that? Let's say I want to go back and do my degree. Can I get credit for that? What would that look like? How would we would have to have some sort of body that would authorize giving away of credit. They're calling that informal learning. There's also, and I do think that we need to take account of this, that this will show up in a minute, the idea of like MOOCs, massive online open courses, MOOC, or massive open online courses, or businesses that require you to complete some kinds of training and give you certificates. How can those certificates be honored and recognized in higher ed, but then also interchangeably with other companies and other groups? They think this is solvable. I think it's wicked. It's cute that they think it's solvable. I just don't think they really understand the complexity of the problem. Again, because they just think learning is interchangeable and who cares. But again, you can make your own judgment call on that. But that's what they mean by formal and informal learning. They identify difficult challenges, and let's praise Allah that they figured out that what the achievement gap is a difficult challenge. Like, thanks for noticing. But it is what it is. Page 28, education has become the most important currency for livable wages, long-term careers. And they encourage us to look at free public post-secondary education in Norway, Germany, and Slovenia. I would actually encourage us to look at in the United States. There are states and systems within states that give free public education. Tennessee made community colleges free. In Texas, a certain percentage and a certain, I'd have to look up the numbers, of people who graduate high school can go to their state schools for free. So we have options that are available, but they are giving that as an option to overcome the achievement gap, which maybe. Again, I don't think that the achievement gap is a difficult problem. I think it's a wicked problem because you have to look at the system, you have to look at systemic racism, you have to look at systemic inequality. We're not even talking about technology here, like access to technology and equity. And again, thank you for noticing in MC, but I think you may have missed the mark here. Digital equity, they say, again, I think this is a bit of a throwaway, but this idea of Internet for All and MOOCs. This idea makes me think of the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Jeff Bezos of the world who go into starving villages in Africa or in African countries or in South America and South American communities and countries and say, I see what you need. We'll just give you all iPads and then life will be better. We'll just give you all internet access without regard for the other public utilities, food, other forms of physical and spiritual nourishment that they may need that has nothing to do with technology or internet. But it's interesting that there is something there. They're in the right direction. Digital equity is the right direction to think about. I don't know if MOOCs and Internet for All is relevant to this particular challenge. Is it difficult? Sure. Again, I don't know if digital equity is a difficult problem or a wicked problem. I think it's probably more of a wicked. And if you're not familiar with MOOCs, go take a look. They are essentially online classes. That the M stands for massive, one of the O stands for open. And they are offered from reputable sources. Most of the MOOCs I'm aware of are given through like first tier or upper tier universities. Stanford has a ton, Yale has a ton, Harvard has a ton, MIT has a ton, Berkeley has a ton. I'm trying to think of other big ones. Think of a big university. Yale does some, Purdue does some. Just go Google. Maybe I'll put this link when I put these slides in this video up. I'll put a link to, I follow a website called openculture.com. It follows open philosophy and open tech. And every month they publish a list of all of the MOOCs that are starting. So this also ties back, if you go back, I'll go back one slide, to the formal, informal learning. Let's say I created a version of this class and I put it online and made a MOOC out of it. What if people completed all the assignments? Could they get credit from Westchester for completing all the assignments? Maybe, without having ever stepped into the classroom. They offer MOOCs as an option to address the challenge of digital equity. Is that a solution? I think they're thinking in the right direction. I don't know if it's going to work the way they want it to. And the wicked ones. I think they are wrong about both. And I think that they also think that knowledge obsolescence and the role of educators are both wicked problems. I wouldn't classify necessarily either as a problem. And where do I start? I hate both of them. The knowledge obsolescence, the process of becoming obsolete or outdated or no longer used. Yes. However, this idea of knowledge obsolescence reminds me if they had any relevance or any knowledge of information theory and history of print and communication and human communication, you'd realize that this was the same arguments that were made when, the printing press was invented and people thought, oh God, we have all these books. What's going to happen? I would also challenge their notion of knowledge becoming obsolete. Uh, if they're referencing keeping knowledge in digital form in devices, knowledge needs human brains. Knowledge needs living human tissue for it to be knowledge. If it's not knowledge, it's information, and it's something different, and it means something different. I'm not terribly worried about knowledge obsolescence in the way that they are framing it. I'm also not necessarily concerned about knowledge expanding beyond what is humanly capable. I think that problem is largely a bit blown out of proportion, a little bit in the science fiction realm. Not from science fiction, that's not what I'm saying. But it's almost like conspiracy theories. When you look at like the explosion of knowledge, in relevance to knowledge obsolescence, when you get to when you're writing your thesis, on the way up to it too, in classes where you will do a lot of reading and a lot of processing, you will realize that once you start doing a lot of reading, there aren't that many new ideas out there. While it may seem that knowledge has exploded, when you start reading, in particular journal articles and book chapters, you will realize that it's not that there are more ideas, it's just people have found different ways to say the same ideas over and over again. Rarely, there are exceptions to that, but again, if you've ever read a lot in MC report authors, you would know that, or you would be a little bit more careful with your words. And then the second, which I don't know how much I can even give time to this, is the role of educators. I think that's crap. I think it's an interesting idea for, like I say in Arkansas, instead of basing funding on how many students start college, institutions will focus on how many students graduate and tying funding to that. I think that's an interesting idea. I think if you want to look at what could happen, go look at standardized testing in K-12 and watch how teachers cheat or only teach to a test so that students learn and that they pass and that blah, 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 blah. And they suggest that we look at faculty as project managers. No. I am not a project manager and I'm not a facilitator. I'm a teacher. It'd be kind of like you arguing for, why don't we look at mothers as parenting facilitators? Like, no, it's a mom. And I don't think that this casts me as anti-change or anti-future. I just don't think that they have a full understanding of what it is faculty and or teachers. I'm looking at this as K-12 too. What teachers do. That it has nothing to do with projects. Woo! This gets me fired up, y'all. So, before I get any more fired up, let's move on. The last section of the report that we're going to focus on are what they call important developments. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of where we're headed. So there's this big chart. I'll come back to it. We look at what's going to happen in a year or less, 2 to 3 years. There's 2 slides because it was long. And then 4 to 5 years. Okay, so let's go back to this chart. I'm not going to go through all of this. When we get back together face to face, I'll pull this up or I'll reference it if I remember, and I'll ask you if you have any questions. They shared this chart. It was just easier for me to reproduce it here for you on page 37 of where they think the big important developments are going, where they're headed. They break them down into 7 categories: consumer tech, internet tech, social media tech, enabling tech, visualization, learning, and digital strategies. Of course, their 3D printing could show up over in enabling tech, or Internet of Things could also show up in social media tech. If you have questions about what these are and what they mean, let's hold off on them, jot them down when we get back together in person next week, because it's never going to snow ever again. We'll talk about them and what these mean. So let's look at what they think. Important developments for a year or less. 1, adaptive technology, and 2, mobile. Excuse me. I can be on board with both, and interestingly, I think they may have gotten this one kind of right. The first, not in the way that they mean it with machine learning. But what I think is interesting is that if you look at what we understand about marketing and advertisement and how that makes adaptive interfaces for the websites and the apps that we use, I think you can see that is true. I don't know how much that has transitioned over into the education world. Like when you're on Amazon and I'm looking for, I don't know, what was I looking for on Amazon? Well, the last thing, because I'm a nerd, I was looking for a book. So I was looking at a book and looking at a book, and I was like, oh, do I want to spend this money or do I want a digital copy? I don't know. It's really new. Anyway, so, on the side or underneath to say, people who bought this book also bought this. Okay, that for me is a pretty decent example of machine learning where they have picked up on patterns of other people's behavior. I don't think they've learned anything, but whatever. And, think about when we're signing up for classes, when y'all are signing up for classes, no one ever goes and like, oh, EDT525. There's not like a little window over to the right that says, people who take 525 also take blah, 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 blah. Maybe you want to sign up for this. It's only on Tuesdays and whatever. Nah, we're not there. Again, I think it's a little bit overhyped. I think it's an interesting idea. Maybe. Also, the second quote there, the authors believe that adaptive learning systems help foster a more personalized, self-paced approach to learning and are most appropriate for teaching basic skills. There's always been a call for more personalized learning. Always, always, always. And I think it's also interesting that they just glossed over that last sentence or the last phrase, that personalized learning and self-paced learning works great for basic skills. Basic skills. Not the more advanced skills that we hope we would be looking at in higher education. But what do I know? Mobile, I also think they're right. Looking at becoming more mobile in the very basics that we all walk around with cell phones, we all walk around with iPads or some form of tablet, or we all walk around with laptops. It used to be that you only had a computer over in your office or in your home, and then you could only do work or only have access to that information when you were there. That's not true anymore. There are some bullets there you can review, or we can ask questions about it when we're together. In 2 to 3 years, I think they're kind of on the way to correct. I'm going to quickly do, so the first is IoT or Internet of Things, and the second is next generation learning management systems, which I think D2L is the exact opposite of a next generation. D2L is your grandmother's learning management system. Not that there's anything wrong with your grandmother, but like it's 2019. Let's look at Internet of Things. So I'm looking around at my house right now, and I've got my Alexa over there. Oh, shit. I said the name. Okay, good. She didn't hear me. She lit up, but she didn't say anything. Well, I've got you-know-who over there that's connected to the Internet. I've got in the bedroom 2 light bulbs that are also connected to the Internet. They're connected via those Philips bulbs where I can change the color and turn them on and off by using my voice. I think it's an interesting idea, the Internet of Things. I don't think we're anywhere near it being 2 to 3 years, at least not in Westchester, and nowhere that I'm aware of, off the top of my head, university-wise or college-wise. They do give some warnings. The first is about privacy, of course, and the second is about emotions. I'm not so sure that I agree with how emotions affect learning, using wearables to monitor biological factors that correspond to emotional states. Like, imagine if I was teaching and I could look over on my iPad or on my computer and see all of your heart rates and all of your breathing and be like, uh-oh, so-and-so is going to pass out because whatever we're doing is too much. I don't know. That's a little much for the Internet of Things. But let me give you like a little picture. I would think it would be really cool. I'd love to get some money to do this. I would love to get a bunch of the you-know-who's, Alexa, right? Or the Google Home. I'd love to get some smart bulbs, other Internet of Things technologies. And I'd like to get in a classroom and make my own version of a smart classroom that's less of a makerspace and more that integrates screens and technologies, in particular oral or audible hearing-based technologies that could transform a classroom in that manner. I don't think we've done a lot of work that way. I think that would be interesting to explore. Anybody got a couple grand you want to throw my way, or know somebody's got some grant money wants to share around? Anybody know a billionaire? Let's go. So Internet of Things, I think they're kind of right. I don't think it's made the jump from our homes to the classroom or to higher ed. I think it would be interesting to do that, but we're not there yet. They also talk about next generation LMSs. LMSs stands for Learning Management Systems. D2L is one, Moodle is one, Blackboard's one, Canvas is one. If I'm thinking of all the places y'all mentioned you went to school. D2L, I think, is the opposite of a next generation. I don't know. It's just if you look at the caliber of university, I'm not saying anything about Westchester. I'm just stating a fact. If you look at the caliber of a university and the amount of money they want to spend on tech, there's a certain tier of university or school or college or school system that uses D2L. And there's also another category of folks that use Canvas and Blackboard. And it is what it is. And I know that some people like to say all learning management systems are created alike. I disagree. They do have similar features, but there's a difference. There's just a difference. There's more of a difference than people want to admit sometimes, but that's whatever it is. What's interesting about the way that they talk about this is that we will actually move away from learning management systems. If you take courses with me outside of this, you'll notice that I do mix it up. So 349 is an undergrad class I'm teaching now. We use iTunes U. You'll see there it is in the list. I've never used Slack for a class. I think it's an interesting idea. I have taught a class only in Google Apps. But I think it's an interesting idea that now that we've spent all this time and energy, getting people into these systems, learning management systems, that now we're going to move everybody out. It's interesting. So they have this idea that we're going to move away from that in 2 or 3 years, and technically this would be right now. I think this is true for a progressive faculty member. I'm not saying I'm particularly progressive, but I have been looking in this way. I don't think the other typical faculty members gives a crap. They're just going to keep using whatever the university has. So they're kind of right, kind of not right. And then 4 to 5 years, again, this is more like a crapshoot. They don't know. They're just throwing ideas out to see if it sticks to the wall. AI, artificial intelligence, and then natural UI, which means user interface. There's a lot of talk about this in science, technology studies, or design experience studies. I just think that the way that, and again, this is not new for you, that the way that people talk about and understand artificial intelligence and machine learning is just reductive, and it doesn't really honor some of the very basic things that AI and machine learning, we need different names for them, can do. We just need to talk about them and think about them in different ways. There's a quote, nice pretty quote there. I don't remember, if I'm perfectly honest off the top of my head, what natural UI means. I mean, I know what natural UI means, but forever they're always going to be talking about how to best work on human-computer interaction and what that interaction and interface looks like. Is that something that's going to be an important development? Sure. Is it going to make a difference in 4 to 5 years? I don't know. It does. It happens right now. I'm not so sure that it's going to be that far out so much as an ongoing development. But that's what they say it will be, or they say it will be important. So that's my overview, y'all. I have no idea how long this is because I can't see the little counter when I'm recording. But I'm imagining that you're probably dead or asleep by now. So wake up. I'm giving you a heads up for what's next week. Next week we're going to do, I'm pretty sure it's week 5. I'm pretty sure this is week 4. Next week is the 19th. We're going to be looking at social media and student identity development. Like I said, we're going from big, and we're going to shrink down and go small for a while. There's a chapter to read. It is from a textbook that was published, I want to say 2 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more. We're only going to look at 2 specific chapters from this book. Next week we're going to look at one of them, and it is on social media. I like this chapter because it gives us some useful language to use, to talk about. I think you'll find that our conversation will be interesting next week when we all get together. And then, sort of a new twist on things, I'll go back and double check on the link to make sure it's live and it works in the syllabus. But there is a podcast. You know, I'm a podcast fiend. I know some of y'all enjoy podcasts. There is a teaching in higher ed podcast, and last spring, they did a special episode on ed tech across the disciplines. It is about 42 minutes long, but if you're like me and you listen to podcasts on double speed, or at least like a speed and a half, like 1.5 speed, you may be able to go a bit quicker. So when I look at 42 minutes on something, I know it's going to take me like 20 minutes because like boom, boom, boom. But when I'm in the car and I listen to these with Frederick, he can't stand it because to him they sound like chipmunks and it makes him anxious. But for me, when I hear a normal speed podcast, it's like they're talking like this slowly, and I can't do it. I can't handle it. So that's where we're at next week. Again, we'll start off by trying to process the NMC report face to face. Go and practice your non-snow dances, And have a wonderful week. If you see me out and about on campus, I'll be out there on Thursday. But again, tomorrow, who knows? But yeah, hope everybody's doing well. I miss y'all. You probably don't miss me, but that's okay. I miss you all just enough for both of us, back and forth. Be well, stay warm, and I'll see you next week.